Despite being released in 2006, Kirby Shqueak Squad feels more like classic Kirby than anything else. Aside from a few extras, the main story is really the only thing there is to finish in this game. It doesn't bring anything new to the series that leaves a lasting impression in my opinion. It was the first traditional 2D Kirby game to be released on the DS, the first Kirby game being Canvas Curse. Canvas Curse, being released 4 months into the DS's lifespan, clearly wanted to try something new with the series, now that this new system was out. It had players using the touchscreen to move and attack as Kirby. Despite touchscreen controls being a bit divisive among gamers at the time, Canvas Curse still managed to receive a positive reception. I can imagine fans still wanted something a bit more traditional for the DS though. Kirby Shqueak Squad definitely delivers on being just that. It doesn't have a plethora of features or stories like Superstar, and it doesn't have a huge map like Amazing Mirror. It follows a way more linear structure of going from world to world, level by level, while picking up collectibles along the way. It got mostly positive reviews, but many would agree that its simplicity, compared to the previously mentioned titles, was the game's biggest shortcomings. It would be followed up by Superstar Ultra in 2008, a remake of the Super Nintendo title, boasting the features from the original game as well as adding a bunch of new ones. From there, Shqueak Squad just kind of became another Kirby game to some people. I think this game goes largely unnoticed by people today. Compared to more recent releases and the fact that it's not an easily accessible game, I wouldn't be surprised if people passed it up. This game still has merits that I think are worth talking about though. While they might not be anything revolutionary, I think the ideas presented here still offer a fun experience nonetheless. The story is super straightforward, even for a Kirby game. Kirby's cake gets stolen, so he goes on an adventure to try and find it, going right to King Dedede as his first stop, before learning that the real thieves are the Shqueaks, leading Kirby to chase them instead. The obvious first thing you might notice when starting the game is the bottom screen, which is Kirby's belly. Kirby can store up to 5 bubbles and you can tap them to gain their effects. You can store copy abilities, healing items, these little Kirbys that can be fused into a 1-up when you get 3 of them, as well as the game's main collectible, treasure chests. You can mix bubbles together to get new ones depending on what you use. Mixing 2 copy ability grants you a new random one, mixing food together makes a better healing item, and you can even mix stars to make bigger ones that you can shoot out for some damage. On the surface, it seems like there's a lot you can do with these bubbles, and you might have even been reminded of Kirby 64's copy ability mixing, but I pretty much just went over almost everything the bubbles are used for. There are copy abilities you can mix to make brand new abilities, but it's not nearly as compelling as Kirby 64, seeing as there's only 5 of them. 3 of them are sword variants, and the other 2 are for bombs. In the case of both the sword and the bombs, they do more damage than their base forms, and that's all they're really good for, to be honest. They don't have special movesets, and aside from the ice sword and the ice bombs, don't really do anything different in the field. Even with the ice variants, all they do is turn enemies into ice blocks that can be thrown at other enemies. Fire can burn bushes and light fuses for cannons, but the sword ability on its own can cut bushes and fire can light fuses. And there's nothing to tell you that these abilities even exist. What's more is that you need the ability scrolls for sword and bomb to make the mix abilities in the first place. So if you mix them together without the scrolls, you can end up thinking that mixing any copy ability will just give you a random one. In my experience, the ability scrolls either unlock really fun moves like Fighter's powered up fireball, or really mundane moves like being able to aim with fire and ice. It's the unlockable techniques like this that make me think they were originally intended to always be a part of the base ability, but they made it into an unlockable scroll just so that they could pad out the game with more collectibles. The tornado ability scroll grants it the ability to turn into an elemental tornado depending on what it interacts with. No, it doesn't have a mix ability. You just need to run into fire or another element while using the tornado ability. I can't help but feel as though there was a huge missed opportunity with these mix abilities. Even if the only mix abilities were just fire, ice, and thunder variants of pre-existing abilities, it would still bring more to the table. In the case of the tornado ability, they should have just made it so that if you mix it with ice, fire, or spark, it would create an elemental tornado right from the get-go, instead of having to spin into lava or something. That being said, Shqueak Squad has a really diverse range of copy abilities. Laser, magic, and UFO are some of my favorite returning copy abilities. UFO is fun to control and has a ton of different attacks. Magic is one of my personal favorites. The idea of using magic tricks as an attack is clever, and bouncing laser beams off angled surfaces to beat enemies is always satisfying. Some new copy abilities introduced in this game include Animal, which lets you dig around in the dirt and maul enemies, Metal, which lets you walk into enemies to damage them, but also makes you slower. There's also Bubble, which lets you turn enemies into bubbles that you can store in your belly for later use. While Bubble isn't the most useful ability in my opinion, it's still cool that they made an ability to complement the new mechanic they made for this game. Finally, there's Ghost, which is unlocked after collecting all the pieces of the medallion that's scattered in the chests you collect throughout the game. It's just a novelty ability that lets you take control of eligible enemies, but it's very fun to experiment and have enemies duke it out with each other. Of course, there's the staple abilities that make their own return, and I could never complain about the fun ones like Hammer, Throw, and Wheel. As I said before, the main collectible in the game are treasure chests. Getting treasure chests is pretty easy, but it's still fun to find them. I especially love the golden Waddle Dee sections where you need to defeat it without letting it kill itself. There's also the segments where you need to race or defeat members of the Shqueaks to get chests. The only thing that I don't like about collecting the treasure chests is that they fill up spaces in the belly, and in order to get what's inside them, you need to bring them to the end of the level with you. There's 3 chests to collect in most levels, meaning you need to keep some spots open if you just want to pick them up and go. If you're going for 100%, that means you'll be throwing out useful stuff to make room for these chests. The contents of the chests go towards unlocking a bunch of stuff. I already talked about the ability scrolls and the ghost ability, but you can also unlock stages, health upgrades, and even different colors for Kirby. Oh my god! Kirby, you're not in Tropic Thunder, take that shit off. There's even an area that you can unlock after getting all the pieces of a map that has all the copy abilities in one place. Very convenient if you just want to pick something up without having to look for an ability in a stage. It even has the triple star ability that unlocks after you beat the game. There's one more collectible that you can get from chests that I left out, those being the star seals. The star seals are actually required to collect if you want to beat the game, as you can't get into the 7th world if you don't have any of them. This means if you get to the end of level 6 and you're missing even one of them, you'll need to go back and get the chest that it's in. Now this may seem like a big deal. No one wants to have to backtrack through all those levels just to finish a game they had no intention of being a completionist in. The game even has the gall to be like, you'll get a surprise if you collect all of them. Okay, yeah, cool. You mean being able to play the rest of the game? But seriously, these chests are easy to get. The game shows you if you're missing treasures, and the seals are always in the big chest at the end of the 1st or 2nd stage. They even made these chests glow to make sure you know that they're important. At the same time, I can't help but feel like this was a stupid cheap way to extend the game time. They really locked the last 2 worlds behind what could easily be mistaken as an optional collectible. It's a fun casual game. You don't need to put this roadblock here. Maybe they wanted the player to feel like they got their money's worth at the time, but if that's the case, then they could have done something along the lines of more mini-games, or like a harder boss rush after you beat the first one. The level design in Shqueak Squad is what makes me relate this game to classic Kirby games like Kirby 3 and 64 the most. The times you'll be navigating off the main path is when you need to enter a star door to find a treasure chest. There's also some stuff hidden only if you have the right ability. These cannons can only be fired if you have an ability to light the fuse, and they usually lead to treasure chests or bubbles you can take with you. That isn't to say that these levels are boring. Kirby's draw is his copy abilities. There's a lot of room to play with when it comes to playing as Kirby thanks to this mechanic. Some levels and puzzles are tailored towards using specific copy abilities, sure. That doesn't always mean you have to use those specific abilities. You can play through the game however you want with whatever copy ability you like, or experiment with ones you aren't too familiar with. I almost never use the throw ability in Kirby games, but this time around I decided to give it a shot and ended up really liking throwing enemies into other enemies. The game also isn't exactly a walk in the park. I died a bit more than I'd care to admit, but I think that's just because of how cocky I would get sometimes. Most of my deaths came from the fact that you drop whatever copy ability you have if you get hit even once, and if you want to keep that ability, you'll probably make a desperate scramble to try and pick it back up before it disappears, leading you to run into enemies or stage hazards. Some stages have objects you can interact with if you have the right ability. For instance, these clouds amplify the range of spark to be able to hit enemies while it's moving, and later on there's stages with metal surfaces that will cause electricity to travel through them, letting you hit enemies that are grounded. The game is overall easy, but I never found myself bored while playing it. The best parts of the levels in Shqueak Squad are the Shqueaks themselves. If you pick up the big treasure chest at the end of a level, it will cause one of the members of the Shqueaks to appear. They'll try to hit you and take your chest before retreating into their hideout. If they do get a chest off of you, you have a small amount of time to enter their hideout and fight them for the chest back. There's also times where you'll have to race them to a chest. These segments add some urgency to some of the otherwise mellow levels and can actually be a bit tense. There were times where I'd just barely be able to recover a chest and then make a mad dash to the exit with one of the Shqueaks right on my tail. There's 3 members of the Shqueaks that can show up and they all have different strengths. Stordo is slow but can break through obstacles with ease, Doc can go wherever he wants with his UFO, and Spinny is crazy fast. While I do think the levels in this game are fun enough on their own, these encounters with the Shqueaks are the perfect addition to making playing through this game that much more fun. The bosses in this game seem to fluctuate in quality. None of them are bad by any means, but you can definitely tell which ones were made while the creative flame was burning the brightest. This game is also notable in the way that Wispy Woods, or some variation of Wispy Woods, doesn't even appear in the game, let alone as the first boss. The first boss is instead Dedede, who doesn't bring anything incredible to the table seeing as how know he's the first boss. Mrs. Moley pops out of holes in the ground and telegraphs her attacks when she shows up in the background. The use of the background, or really anything that makes the fight different than just hitting the boss while dodging its attacks, is somewhat rare or not really touched upon. Mrs. Moley seems to want to start a trend of bosses that utilizes things like this in the background, but sadly, they never truly capitalize on it. In the case of Mecha Krako, the challenge is only really present if you don't have a copy ability, or if you lose your copy ability in the middle of the fight, making it so you have to shoot enemies at him. The enemies can fall off the ledges if you're not fast enough, making it so you'll have to wait for more to catch if you miss them. Yadogane's gimmick is that he's an auto-scroller where you dodge debris falling from the ceiling. He can occasionally speed up to try and hit you, but the boss mostly feels like a beatdown with the mass amounts of ammo you can get if you don't have a copy ability. The next boss, Bobo, at least has an alternate means to cause damage to him. If you get him to crash into the lava, rocks will drop from the ceiling, which can be used to damage him while he's on the ground. He can also fly around in the background sometimes, but it doesn't really mean anything. Daroch is technically fought twice, but not much is different between the fights. I think this ice beam attack in the second fight is the only difference between the two. Meta Knight has some new attacks compared to his past iterations, but it's really not enough to set him apart from them. The final boss, Dark Nebula, actually has us chase it through a small stage before fighting it. If you're not careful, you can end up having to fight Dark Nebula with low HP if you took damage while chasing it around. The fight against Dark Nebula itself is fairly inoffensive. It changes its moveset based on the element it's currently using, which keeps you on your toes at least. Actually, I think inoffensive is probably the best way I would describe the bosses in this game. They have redeeming qualities, but I think the reason there's anything good about them is because they decided to play it safe when designing them. 3 of the bosses are inspired from previous Kirby bosses, and the others are just standard boss fights for a platformer. These fights kind of leave me on the fence when I think about them. On one hand, yeah, they don't do anything incredibly new, but on the other hand, it would have been nice to see something new. Maybe a boss who bubbled your copy abilities or something. Regardless of my neutrality towards these bosses, I still think this game is better with them than without. The only thing to look forward to after beating the game are the short mini-games and the boss rush. The mini-games can be played with friends if you're able to find people who have this game today. The boss rush is probably the best feature that unlocks after beating the game, but unlike other Kirby games, doesn't unlock a harder version when you beat it. Throughout this video, I've talked about the missed opportunities this game made regarding its mechanics and gameplay. Despite the lack of anything super new, this game still is fun. Not every new entry to a franchise has to bring something amazingly groundbreaking to the table. Sometimes staying neutral and going back to the basics is fine as well, and this game proves it. Even though I think that it could have been something more, doesn't mean it necessarily had to be. I would still recommend it to people who haven't played it yet. It's an overall good time, and you really can't go wrong with it.